Greetings and salutations, and finally now good afternoon, the RF Village. Our next speaker is going to bring to you a wonderful presentation on some iClass information. This might actually be slightly helpful for some stuff in the village. Competitors. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our speaker and he will take things from there.
Hello, DEFCON. So I've got a talk for you guys today. Does this set up so I can talk hands-free? So I'm going to be talking about iClass today. And as the title might give away, throwing away the keys. Because we all know that for authenticated systems, you only need keys to talk to them. And sometimes you can get those keys easily, like iClass Legacy, and sometimes you can't. And this talk will be about what you do when you can't, and some of the interesting options that you have available to you. Because you think that, no, it's fine. You think that normally you don't have keys, you can't do much, but that might not always be the case. All right, can you guys still hear me? Excellent. Mic a bit closer. All right, well, that's a bit. What about now? Good? More. All right. So, what I'm going to talk to you about today, going to do a bit of an introduction to who I am, current state in iClass, my adventures writing an iClass emulator twice, the interesting authentication bypass vulnerability I found, a bit of version analysis of what is and isn't affected, and then the adventure doing responsible disclosure, and where to from here. So, who am I? I'm Tiernan, or NVX on a lot of social things, GitHub, Discord. I'm just some guy that likes breaking things. I don't do this for a living, but I find it fun. So I get home from being a software engineer and break things and sit in front of a computer more. Go from the bad screen to the good screen. I wrote the iClass, which is pick-a-pass emulation code for the Chameleon Mini and Tiny platforms, and then later also for the FlipZero, everyone's favorite. I also occasionally contribute to the Proxmark 3 Iceman 4 codebase, and sometimes where I contribute even works. Sometimes not on the first attempt, but we get there in the end. And what I'm going to talk to you today is about iClass, why you should stop using it in any forms, and dropping a new vulnerability, and the fun of responsibly disclosing vulnerabilities to vendors in this security space. So, I'm going to go through a brief current state of iClass. I'm going to assume a little bit of prior knowledge about RFID and PACS in general. So apologies if some of it, if you're brand new to RFID, I just don't think I've got the time to go super in depth. Hopefully a lot of you came from the awesome talk that Babak, Nick, and Aaron just did in the main stage. That would have covered quite a lot of it. That was a great talk. If you haven't, check the recording. It was great. So what the fuck is iClass? So it's RFID technology from HID Global. And it's mostly used in corporate environments. Like, it's fairly rare that you're going to see that at like a hotel, right? It's for business, corporate, sort of where it's aimed at. And the chance that you've seen these in the wild, if it's not at your work, you've probably walked through an airport and seen them, or walked through the Las Vegas Convention Center West Hall and seen these little black squares on the wall with a little red line at the top. I've got one here. They're super common. And to the right are those newer, sleeker looking ones. They're a newer version of those readers called Signo, but same sort of thing. And they talk to lots of different cards. What we're focusing on today is iClass. That can be a little white card like this that may or may not be printed with your employee badge on it. It could be a little key fob that you've got on your keychain. Sometimes they're used in apartment buildings for like the front door. You might have a key to your apartment, but the front door might be a little tappy tap thing. There's also like a sticker thing. That's that little black one at the top in the middle there. Haven't really seen those in the wild as much, but they exist. So chances are you've seen these. If not, actually use them. iClass is made by a company called HID Global. They're a subsidiary of Assa Abloy, and one of the sort of original guys in the PACS world. They've got a pretty big market share, especially in US, Australia, and Singapore, but they're probably elsewhere too. And they've been around for ages. They started off with HID procs type stuff that are just completely unsecured, and then went from there. I think that was in the 90s. So, they're not one of these companies that have just sprung up. So a brief history of iClass. So in 2002, HID iClass Legacy was released, and that was as a secure alternative to the 125 kilohertz procs. That was just basically, you put the card in the field and it just starts shitting out some data. And that data is what let you into the building. So as you can imagine, not a super secure model where any reader could just put 125 kilohertz field and it'll start modulating it back. So they used a chip from Inside Contactless. I think they're Inside Secure now, or maybe it was the other way around. And they had a line of cards called PicoPass. And they were based on 15693, ISO 15693 that is. And they had some proprietary command set, including anti-collision, so you can't just read it with like your phone, even though your phone can read 15693 tags, just because it's that proprietary command set. But it has some features that the 125 kilohertz procs doesn't have, which is it's a bidirectional, so the reader actually talks first to the card and back and forth, and part of that back and forth is a mutual authentication to make sure that both the reader and the card are using the same keys, and if either doesn't match, it'll bomb out and, hey, you can't read the card. So, your credential's a bit more secure. To make it even more secure again, and this is generally best practice, rather than just having like one key on every card, like if I broke this one card, hey, I've got everyone's key, right? They'll have like a master key and then take like the serial number of the card and use that key to actually talk to the individual cards. And that's what's called key diversification. And HID, following best practice, implemented a key diversification function. In fact, they implemented two for some reason. One for their what's called standard key. Standard keys is basically everyone's using the same key. Sounds like a bad idea, doesn't it? And their Elite program was where you could have your own customer-specific key, fully managed by HID. So you sign up for their Elite program, and then you could get cards from them, or later encode your own cards with your key, and that meant that no one else's cards would work on your system at all because the keys were different. Fast forward to 2010, there was a really, really interesting bit of research published called The Heart of Darkness, exploring the uncharted backwaters of HID iClass. They basically found that if you got one of the original readers, ripped it apart, you could dump the firmware off it through some very clever tricks that they did. And suddenly, anyone using standard keys, rip. Your keys are now known, anyone can read your cards, anyone could write new cards, game over. So the recommendation was move to Elite. Just after that, the iClass SE platform was released. It may have actually been 2010, not 2011, but I was Googling. About that era. And they had moved on the newer reader platforms to what's called a secure element, or a SAM. And that SAM it's basically a really small microcontroller that can do cryptographic operations and store keys to do those cryptographic operations, but really hardened. So they're fairly resource limited, so you don't want to use it just for everything because you can't. But they're designed with one job, and one job that it does really well is protecting those keys so you can't get those keys out. And with that, they launched a few new technologies, but iClass SE is basically confusing because they called the readers that and a whole bunch of stuff. But what we're focusing on is the iClass SE cards. And they're the same silicon as the original iClass legacy cards, but they changed the data on it. So rather than just being a optionally DES-based encrypted payload that was not diversified at all, It's now got a payload that's diversified on the card serial number as well. So rather than just the card keys to talk to the card being diversified, the actual encrypted data is now diversified based on the card as well, which is a good move because you can't just copy the data from one card to another, even if you knew the card keys. A lot more secure. They also changed the keys from DES to AES, and with that used NIST standard KDF function to make those diversified keys. So one of the next problems with iClass, especially Elite, the standard KDF, it wasn't as bad, but the Elite KDF in 2012, Flavio Garcia, who's done quite a lot of research in the RFID space, released the Dismantling iClass and iClass Elite paper. And the big ticket takeaway from that one was that if you talk to a reader with certain card serial numbers, you could get the responses back from the reader, like you're doing sort of the first half of the authentication and then just dropping out and swapping to the next one, and exploiting some cryptographic weaknesses in the KDF function that Elite keys used. You could actually recover the original Elite master key. So that meant that all legacy Elite systems, game over, just the same as legacy iClass. But the good news is iClass SE, they use AES. You're not breaking AES. And you're definitely not breaking KDF that has been endorsed by NIST. Like, it's pretty good. They did the right things with SE. So even though the cards have some issues, which we'll go into later, it was a pretty good secure alternative. And although they released support for SIOs on their SE platform with DESFire cards and also CIOS, the real advantages with the PicoPass cards are they were dirt cheap. You can get them cheaper than a DESFire, you can get them cheaper than a CIOS by far. Like, we're talking an order of magnitude difference in cost compared to CIOS, and maybe half the price of a DESFire. So, like, pretty attractive. The other nice thing is it's a very simple card that meant that it didn't draw much power from the reader, which meant that you could read it from the reader at a fair distance. Whereas like a CIOS and a DESFire, it's going to be pretty close. Prox and iClass could both be read from a further distance. So some people, if they've got a card in their wallet, they don't want to take it out every day, they just boop against the reader. We're not talking meters, we're talking a difference of centimeters, but you don't want to be fumbling at your reader. So there were definitely some pros with the PicoPass technology. Roll forward to a bit further in 2021. Obviously, this is an abridged history. There was definitely some more cool shit happening in between. But 2021, the RevE readers, which are these very square-looking ones, they're announced end of life and end of sale. That then got extended the next year to the next month even for end of life. I'm guessing the supply chain shortages hurt everyone. Because, I'm sure they would have loved to just sell you the new Signo readers, but yeah. And in 2023, there was a really sweet app for everyone's favorite dolphin. Got released by Eric Betsy, with the propeller hat, go hit him up, called Cedar, which let you basically get one of those HID SAMs and act like a full reader like this, except, hey, it's your dolphin. And because the flipper was actually doing all of that, you could sniff the data going back and forth, which becomes important too. Like, you could still do it with a reader, but you'd have to have a reader and then a prox mark attached to it and then put a card on front. Like, it's a lot more hassle. So this sort of streamlined that whole operation of doing downgrade attacks and sniffing that I'll go into a bit later. So the new readers, iClass SE, I sort of went over this a bit before. The important bit is the SIOs are encrypted, signed, and cryptographically bound to the card serial number. So with Legacy, you could easily just grab the data, like even if you didn't have the encryption key to decrypt and mint your own PACS data. So like, think the Wiegand data that comes out, right? Your facility code, card number. Even if you couldn't mint your own of those, you could just copy it from one card to another. Like, who cares? It wasn't like a session encryption where like the data going from the card back and forth was encrypted with the keys that you use to authenticate to the card. These cards aren't that complex. So it's just like a USB stick. You can copy the data from one USB stick to another, encrypted, unencrypted, who cares? Which is very different to like a secure channel with, a CIOS or even DESFire if you're doing it right. So that was a big step up from Legacy. HID really do prioritize backwards compatibility, though. So they also released what's called iClass SR, which is basically an iClass legacy card. Then they also tack on an SIO at the end. What that does mean, though, is that the actual card keys are the same as legacy, but you do get the advantage of the SIO and being bound to that CSN. So even though you could copy the data to another card, the SIO isn't going to work anymore. But there's some problems with that. And they still offer the standard key set, also the Elite, which is the HID managed custom keys per customer. And there is also a custom keying option, but that's not super common. And that's where basically the customer manages their own custom keys. But we're throwing away the keys, so who cares? So this is the Cedar. That's what it looks like. It's pretty cool. And see that little blue board on the top? That's actually the SAM, and just a lot more convenient. So iClass SE, like, we can do downgrades with Cedar, so we can read the PACS data and we can encode that to a legacy card. Or if it's an SR card, you don't even really need Cedar because you could just read the data directly off the card and just read the legacy PACS data, which is almost always the same as the SIO data, and then just downgrade it to a legacy card. It's like, eh. And unfortunately, lots of installations have legacy technology still enabled. At the beginning of this year, HID made a push to disable legacy technologies, which was great, but I can guarantee that no one's really hitting their readers. It's going to be up to the integrators. No one likes to call out the integrators just for funsies. It's working. It's fine. But let's ignore all that. Let's just assume that we've disabled legacy iClass, including SR, and we've just got iClass SE. Now, ideally, you're using Elite keys, so they're just yours. But even if you're standard, their standard keys aren't public. They're in the SAM. They should be secure, right? Like, you can't just copy one of these cards and, dip it on your reader, right? Right? Ish, kinda. So Pickup has got a few features. So it's old. It's similar sort of eras like MyFair Classic. It's definitely not as new as Desfire or CEOS. It's a lot better than 125 kilohertz proc, so for the day, that's great. But there's some limitations of that silicon. So most things when it's doing a mutual authentication, you want to have like a random number that you encrypt with a key, you send that, the other side decrypts it, changes it a little bit, encrypts it again, sends it back, you decrypt that, you check that it's legit. But that relies on random numbers, because if you don't have a random number, you could just replay the same authentication every time, right? And these cards don't have a random number generator on them. It's not like MyFair Classic, where the original ones had one, but it just wasn't great and you could predict it. These just don't have one. So instead, they've got what's called an ePurse value, which is designed for like a stored value type thing, where you're like, I'm going to load $10 on my card, and then bip, and now it's $9. HID obviously don't use it for that. But one of the things that the ePurse gets used for as well is also as the nonce for or card challenge part during that mutual authentication. And it relies on the fact that you can't change the value to what it was before. But it does rely on the reader updating that ePurse value every time it's read. Because if it doesn't get changed, you're back to the problem before. You can just do a replay. One of the other limitations is that there's no encryption between the card and the reader. Now, that, like USB stick analogy before, like the data that's on it may be encrypted, right? But there's no intrinsic encryption when you're reading or writing data from this card. It's all plain text. There is a MAC used during mutual authentication, so you can ensure that both sides have got the same key. Also, when you're doing a write operation, there's a MAC. But other than that, there's no cryptography. So you can just sniff that data in the clear text as I hit it to a reader with a prox mark. I can just sniff it. So it's not great. But, at least SIOs are encrypted, authenticated. It's hard to tamper with those. So prox mark go bar, we can sniff. One of the bigger problems is that, like, sniffing's, it's a bit of an art, right? You got to You do a sniff, and hey, look, I saw half the conversation. I saw what the reader said. I didn't see what the card said, or vice versa. Like, it can be a bit finicky. But what you can do is, and I believe the first attack was when you're sniffing with a Proxmark, when it sends the ePers write command, you can just jam it by like just putting out noise, and that will stop the card from hearing that, hey, update ePers. And now you have a card that you know what the MACs were used for to authenticate to the card, and the ePers value hasn't changed. You can just replay that. The other way that you can do it, and this was sort of weaponized a bit on the Flipper Zero, but you could do it on Proxmark before that, but you had to know what you're doing a bit more, is what's called an NR MAC replay. So NR is the nonce, and MAC is the MAC of that nonce. So you can basically talk to the card, get its ePers and card serial number value, go to your reader, authenticate to that reader, or start the authentication process, and you present it the card challenge and card serial number from that card, collect the MACs from that reader, and then you take those MACs and you go back to your card. And the ePers value, nothing's changed on the card. So you can then just replay those MACs to the card, and now you're authenticated to the card. Now, you can't do writes to the card because those still have a cryptographic MAC to authenticate the writes. But for any read operations, there's no more cryptography after you've authenticated. So you can just read the contents of the card. And that often ends up being a bit more reliable because you're not trying to sniff another reader's field, which is kind of magic. You're just now talking to a card normally. And you can do it multiple times. You can read different blocks. You know, if you get an error, hey, you can try again. You don't have to redo your whole sniff. What that means is, even if you get that SIO, you can't then read it easily because it's encrypted. But if that SIO is standard keyed, and even in a lot of elite keyed systems, it sometimes is. I don't know why it's not always elite keyed. It should be. But sometimes you'll find an elite keyed SE card with standard keyed SIO data on it. So you can take that and you can present it to a HID SAM and get it to decrypt it. Now you think, hang on a minute, how do you do that? Because the HID SAM will want to authenticate to the card first. But remember that SR mode where it was legacy keys, but with an SIO? So you can take, we already know the legacy key, we can take that, make a fake legacy card that has an SIO and the legacy data on it, punch in that SIO into the SR card, present it to a reader, or like this, where you just read it as the PACS data, or you can present it to CEDA, and then decrypt that SIO data. So now we've got the plaintext PACS data again. And again, though, you've disabled SR and legacy on your readers, right? So hopefully that's not a problem. Yeah, you know the card number, the facility number, the format, but like, yeah, you still haven't copied the card. Like, it'd let you do a downgrade, which ain't great, but it's not too bad. And you can't get the, like, you could, if SR was enabled, or legacy, with Elite, thanks to the research with the demystifying iClass and iClass Elite, you could recover the Elite key, but you can't recover the SE Elite key, because that's AES-based, good security. So you're fine, right? Just really make sure you've got SR and SE disabled. Yeah, you can read the data, but you can't present it back to the reader. Right? We're fine. So let's change tact a little bit. So I find that if I want to truly understand something, I need to write an implementation of it, right? Like, I can read a data sheet, but there's lots of little edge cases that until you write code, you might not necessarily think to ask, that question. So I was like, hey, this chameleon tiny, I saw one on AliExpress, picked one up, I'm like, that's cool, that's so small, that's sweet. I want one. Because, iClass cards, like, yeah, they're cheap if you buy them in bulk and that, but like, if you buy them on eBay, because I'm just doing this for a hobby, 10, 15 bucks for a card. I'm in Australia, things are expensive, there's Australia tax. So like, an emulator, like, hey, I don't have to worry about, trying to get these cards and burning them because I did dumb things. I'll just emulate it, right? Like, Proxmark, you got attached to a computer, it's painful. This thing, hey, it's cool. Now, don't confuse this with the newer Chameleon Ultra. So the Chameleon Ultra looks exactly like this, but says Ultra. It unfortunately doesn't support 15693. So you can't do iClass things on it. This is the older one that is hard to get these days, but yeah. So the hardware on it. The Chameleon originally was designed ages ago, much older than the Tiny. The Tiny was just sort of like the very latest version of it. And it was based around this ATX Mega 128 84U chip, which is old. It's an 8-bit AVR. They clocked it at 27.12 megahertz, which isn't the fastest that you can clock this chip at, but it is a nice multiple of the 1356 megahertz carrier frequency that high frequency RF runs at. So 2 times. Very convenient for doing this sort of stuff, because it was basically just bit banging the modulation. Like, there was no NFC front end. There wasn't even like any proper DAC or FPGA. Like the Proxmark's got an FPGA, it's got an ADC, it's got a bunch of resistor ladders type stuff and drivers to drive the field on a much faster MCU as well. This thing's just an 8-bit AVR using interrupts to modulate the field high and low as needed. Like, I'm impressed that they got this working. Like, it was good. But it did provide some challenges because doing cryptography in software is slow at the best of times, and I'm now doing it on this really slow chip. And it's not like it was a standard-based thing where the Macs were just like, oh, I can just throw it into like the DES accelerator, and hey, I've got my Macs back. It's fully proprietary from Encrypt32, I think is the name of the cipher, from Inside Contactless, hence the in front of it. And it was basically like a 32-bit Mac. Fully proprietary. Yeah, it was a bad time. So what I discovered is readers for iClass have got a really short timeout, something like 300 microseconds. And that's between you sending, like the reader sending the authenticate command and the card starting to transmit its reply with the max. And 300 microseconds really isn't much on such a slow microcontroller. I spent ages optimizing. I think I got up to like 350 microseconds or something, and like it was just kind of on the edge, but not really, and it was still too slow. And then I realized, I was like, hang on, what if I like just start transmitting before I know the MAC yet? Because there's like a preamble, and then there's some other data, and then there's the MAC. So it's like, what if I just start transmitting what I can, and hopefully by the time, because that transmission's happening in interrupts. So while my code's calculating the crypto, the interrupts are firing, interrupting my code, doing the modulation of the first half of this packet that I haven't even fully assembled yet, while my slow-ass crypto is running to finish the rest of the packet. And it worked. It was great. I honestly didn't think it would work. I was thinking, surely not. This is like the dirtiest hack known to mankind. But it worked. I was happy. And then I was like, I'm just not going to look at this terrible sin I ever did again. And so I'm like, yeah, this is great. Tap it on one reader, works. Tap it on another reader, it works. Tap it on another, oh, why didn't it work? And so I'm thinking, all right, maybe it wasn't fast enough. Like, does this reader have an even, quicker timeout? Because like, depending on the cards, like some cards are slightly faster than others. And it's like, and I noticed that there was a trend that any old readers didn't work. So Rev A, Rev B, Rev C. But Rev E readers worked. I'm like, oh, that's weird. And so I went digging, I'm trying to do a sniff, and like sniffing sometimes hard. And like I was sniffing, I just wasn't getting any data on the sniff. I'm like, this is weird. I'm like, and the reader wasn't responding at all. It wasn't like it said bad, did the sad auth. It was just like nothing. I'm like, that's weird. And so I'm going through a fine-tooth comb and end up getting a real card against a reader that worked and did a full sniff, and then my emulated card did a sniff, and like with the same ePerse data, same card serial number. Now the reader does have a random number generator in it, so it's not going to be exactly the same each time. But I thought, hang on, what if instead of using a real reader, I use a Proxmark? So you use a Proxmark, and the Proxmark, it just uses zeros, I think. It's not designed to be a secure reader. It's designed to break things. So I'm like, this is great. I'll read my card, I'll read my emulated card, and I'll go through line by line and check. Make sure that I'm doing everything fine and compare the timings. I think I ended up finding a bug in the Proxmark code with the timings with 15693 stuff where it was doing some weird things. That was one of the things I think I broke before fixing properly. And in the end, it turned out it wasn't timing. I had a bug in my code. I literally just forgot to call a function during the crypto initialization, so it wasn't initializing the cipher state properly. And then I fixed that bug, and all right, it now matches, and I bipped it on the old reader again, and it still didn't work. I'm like, what the? Anyway, so after digging through a bunch of papers and all that sort of stuff, I discovered that 15693 as a standard actually supports two different ways of modulating the data from the reader to the tag. One is on-off key modulation, where like here's the carrier, and then it stops the carrier entirely, and then here's the carrier again, and that's how you get the ones and zeros. But it also supports what's called ASK, or amplitude shift keying, which is where instead of like turning the field off entirely, it'll just like turn it off a bit. And that's actually handy for some use cases where you want the card to work at a longer distance because you're still providing some power to the card when you're doing that ASK modulation. And 14443B uses that modulation by default, and whereas 14443A uses on-off keying. And that's why the sort of smart card type things were normally B before they were A, because you get that higher power transfer. And for some reason, 15693, it's like, yeah, you can support both. But like, it's weird because they mandate that cards actually have to support both. There's no choice. Whereas readers are free to choose whichever they please. So it's like, you can't really make use of the extra power, but like maybe you get slightly better read range. I don't know. Anyway, after a bunch of stuffing around, turns out those older readers were using ASK modulation. And the newer readers were using on-off key modulation. And due to some weirdness with the Chameleon Tiny's analog front end, it just couldn't hear that ASK modulation. It was originally designed just for 14443A, which is on-off key modulation. 15693 got added afterwards, and the hardware just wasn't designed to detect that. So it just couldn't hear the reader. And it's like, oh, okay. Flipper Zero can, which is nice. That's a story for a bit later. Then it's like, hang on a minute. The real reason it wasn't working was because, like, you know, I had a stuffed up crypto and wrong modulation, but like, if I had the crypto wrong, why did it work at all on RevE readers? They're a bit more playing, and tried Signo readers, they work too, and I'm just like, hang on, surely I'm imagining this. So like, just quickly go into the Proxmark code, comment out the bits where it like calculates the max, go to the reader, tap, it worked. Sending just zeros as the card MAC. And I'm like, why does sending zeros work? The whole point is that the reader sends a MAC, the card decrypts that MAC, generates its own MAC based on the decrypted data that was in the reader's MAC, and then sends it, and then the reader checks the card MAC, and then it all works well. And after the reader verifies it, and if any of that doesn't match, the MACs don't match, and it's not going to work. And then I thought, well, hang on, but if I tap an elite keyed card to a reader, it doesn't read. You know, if the reader's standard keyed or vice versa. And then I'm like, hang on, but the card checks the MAC. So when the reader sends its MAC, the card checks it. And if it doesn't match, the card just doesn't respond. But when the card generates the MAC and sends it to the reader needs to check that too. So any real card, like, you're not going to notice this problem with. When you're emulating and you're lazy, or maybe it's not that you're lazy and maybe it's just that, hey, it works, it's good enough. Or maybe it's that you're only just managed to be fast enough to make the crypto work in the first place, and you just really didn't even have time to calculate what the correct MAC that the reader should be sending was. You're like, that's fine, it doesn't need to be secure. Yeah, so it turns out RevE readers and Signo were not checking the MAC. So now you've got an iClass card, iClass SE, and I did a bunch of testing, and even with ASK modulation, legacy readers weren't affected. So Rev A, Rev B, Rev C, they were checking the MAC properly. And in fact, even when you're using an OEM reader, those were also fine. But it's like, that's the same secure element. But it turns out, so you'll see here, most OEM readers are unaffected. It turns out the R7 and newer SAMs are fine. R8 and above, and pretty much every RevE reader is R8 and above, so that includes Signo, is affected. And what happened between R7 and R8 is they changed their SAM firmware from being a native code running on the chip, so probably written in C, I hope, hopefully not assembly. And they changed it so that what runs on the firmware is actually a .NET interpreter, just like a Java card, right? You've got some JVM effectively running on the silicon, and then you load Java applets in that you wrote in Java. Makes it a lot easier. You know, you're dealing in a memory-safe language. Great idea to write, secure code in, right? Rather than C, where you can quite easily have lots of problems. Here, we're a .NET shop, not a Java shop. So they bought out a company that were developing .NET card technology to compete with Java cards, and they used it internally. And R8 is when they switched from native firmware to .NET assemblies to do all the real work. So at some point, someone rewrote the iClass code to do those Macs in .NET to run on the SAM. And it works, but they forgot to check the reader Mac. It just reminds me of that like go-to-fail Apple bug that came out, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, where checking TLS certificates, they just forgot to check. So you could present an invalid certificate and it would accept it as if it worked. But, for any real server, it works fine. And this is why when you're testing most code, you test it, you make sure it works, you're happy, cool, unit test passed, send it. But like when you're working, especially with security, that's not good enough. You need to test the things that shouldn't work. Like when a door, you test it and the door opens when it's expected, that's great. But part of the job of that reader and door is to make sure it doesn't open for people that it shouldn't open for. So you need to test that, like, hey, if the card sends a bad MAC, you got to test against misbehaving cards, not just, oh yeah, the real card, if the key's wrong on the real card, it doesn't work. But like, that's the card enforcing the security at that point, not the reader. There was a little bit controversial maybe if people are English, but there was a attempt of the IRA to bomb the hotel where Margaret Thatcher was, and they didn't succeed. She wasn't in there. They missed her by 2 minutes, and there was a comment of, oh, they didn't get lucky this time. But for that kind of adversarial thing, you only need to get lucky once, your adversary, whereas your defender needs to be lucky every single time. It takes one mistake, and you've compromised the security. And that's something that, obviously that's a fairly grim where that quote's come from, but it's something to think about in like the digital security world as well, that it's the same sort of principle. Like I only need to get lucky once to find the vulnerability, and then I've broken lots of things. Now, if this was any other card technology, it wouldn't be as bad. Like if you were using like a CIOS card, for example, and they forgot to check a MAC, it actually wouldn't matter too much because that same mutual authentication is then used to drive keys that are then used to encrypt and MAC all of the comms back and forward. And like, you really want to be checking the MACs of your data. But like, even if you were checking no MACs, if the data's encrypted and you decrypt the data with the wrong key, the data's just gibberish at that point. Like, there's some attacks that you can do if you're not checking MACs, but like, it's not as bad as just, hey, I can send everything. And that's one of the problems with these cards, is that they're really old and they don't support, best practice of like actually encrypting that data. Like the data on it's encrypted, but there's no, it's like session security. If you go to like a HTTPS website and it's using TLS, right? The data on it is encrypted, right? But it's not encrypted once and then the same data sent every time, because you could just go, oh, that's google.com. I know because that's the same encrypted data as when I go to google.com. Every time you go to google.com, it encrypts that with new data, new keys. So the data's different every time, like until you decrypt it, and then you go, oh yeah, it's the same plain text, but the ciphertext is different. And that's the difference between that sort of session security versus data security. And you do both, right? That's the best practice, and that's what CIOS cards do, for example. So while in theory iClass SE was secure, it meant that one mistake meant that you got problems. Now, you can't easily just clone this iClass SE card to another card, because those SIOs are cryptographically bound to the card's serial number, and we don't have magic PicoPass cards today. We might in the future. We might maybe have one in the future that also don't check card backs. That'd be neat. But today, we don't. So it's not a full plastic-to-plastic clone, but you can definitely emulate it with a flipper. You can emulate it with a Proxmark. You can emulate it with a Chameleon Tiny. So in addition to writing the Chameleon Tiny mini PicoPass code, by the time I got a flipper a couple of years later, I was also like, hey, let's write it for that too. Someone gave me the idea. And it was funny because it was like the official Flipper Zero documentation were like, yeah, we can read iClass, but like you can't emulate iClass. Like the NFC chip we use doesn't support that. Like it's just physically not possible. And I took that personally. So I did the impossible because it could. And because I was playing with the same chip before I got a flipper anyway, and was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure there's some sweet transparent modes that you can do some cool shit with. So when I wrote it, I knew about this vulnerability, and I was, much faster and more modern chip in the Flipper Zero. I started to do some optimization, but I checked the max by default on that one from the reader because I knew that the Flipper Zero is pretty popular, so I didn't want to just like hand like an armed weapon to every person. But there's this really suspicious debug flag if you have a look in the Flipper Zero PicoPass code, and that flag's going to disappear soon. But PicoPass debug ignore bad RMAC. I wonder what an RMAC is. Is that maybe a reader MAC to ignore the reader MAC if it's bad? Oh yeah, that's actually exactly what it's doing. It's and it'll even do a log say got a bad MAC from the reader. And bail out. But if you compile the Flipper Zero code with that flag defined, or you just delete those lines out, all of a sudden you can do some naughty things. And now let's on the topic of naughty things, let's see if I can do a demo. Now we don't have a down camera unfortunately, so I'm going to just do something super dodgy and just open up my webcam, and hopefully I can do a live demo for you that won't be too bad. If I can... Yeah, that'll probably do. Yeah, just ignore the microphone. So, we got a Flipper Zero. You probably can't read any of that, can you? Yeah. All right, maybe this is going to be kind of moot. Basically, you can do an NRMAC replay to read the card data from this without keys. You can then compile the PicoPass app with that flag and then tap it to a reader. If you want, I'll be at that first table there. I can give you a little showcase, but just trust me, it works. And in fact, you'll be able to try it for yourself because we'll probably do a pull request and just, now that that's public, just release it. So, on to the next bit, vulnerability disclosure. So, is Timeline implementing this the simulation, discovering the bug, fixing the bug, pull requesting it? And I was a little bit torn when I discovered this because I go to an airport to go on a plane, as you do, and I walk around, I see these hid iClass readers on the walls, and I'm just like, shit, I know some problems with those. And I'm like, I like going on planes. I like my planes being secure. And I know that there's some problems with the readers securing these facilities. I don't like this. I want to arrive at my destination safely. But then I also reflect and go, I remember when the MyFair Classic vulnerabilities were first released and they tried to disclose to the vendor. It was met with lawsuits. I know there's Boston Public Transport, met with lawyers. I know Assa Abloy in only the last couple of years, which is the parent company of HID, has gone after people with lawyers. I'm like, I'm just doing this for fun. I can't afford lawyers. So I was torn. I'm like, do I drop this as a 0-day anonymously so it can't be tied back to me? But then I'm like, well, that's harmful. But I'm also like, any idiot can stumble across this. Like, it's not a complicated exploit. And then it's like, well, so I was talking to some members of the RFID community, and they put me in contact with some people at HID that knew what was going on. And I managed to have a disclose to them in February 2023. And in July, August 2023, I can't remember the exact date, we got a fix for Signo readers. So 10.0.5.7 and above is not affected by this vulnerability. I finally got a CVE number reserved like 3 days ago, maybe 2 days ago. So I've got a number, great. Unfortunately, we don't have a RFID patch yet, and as a result, we don't have an official PSA from HID about this vulnerability yet. If you look up that CV, you'll find it's reserved. There's no details on it yet, because it's not. This is the first public announcement for it, but like it's been a year and a half. And it has been rediscovered since then. And like I can understand why, right? Like RFID, more than a decade old at this point. It's basically end of life. Like it had already been announced end of life, and then they extended it. If it wasn't extended, it would have been end of life as well. It was already hard to upgrade. Like at least it could be upgraded, unlike the older readers. But upgrades were brittle. It was easy to brick, and it involves going to each reader, power cycle the reader, hit it with Reader Manager. If it even supports Reader Manager, there's some older versions that you'd have to first use config cards to upgrade the firmware, and that's even more brittle. And obviously HID didn't want to like release a new firmware that's going to break things, so they've got internal QAs, and they're probably just quietly sitting there hoping that they can just forget about it. And I'm sure people have moved on in the time period that those readers have been around. So like dealing with old stuff is hard. I'm a software engineer by day job. I can fully empathize with that. So what should I do? If I've got HID readers, what's the mitigation? If you've got Signo, good news, upgrade to the latest version. Always update to the latest version. There are bugs that get fixed with security implications. Keep up to date. The other thing you should do, and this is whether you've updated your reader or not, is disable iClass. I'm talking legacy, SE, SR. Even if you've got the fix for this, there are other problems with it. You really want to be moving to a more secure technology. Even Desfire EV1, while it can have that session security by default, with HID stuff, it doesn't, because it's configurable. I don't know why they didn't configure it. Maybe they thought, oh, the SIO is encrypted. But what it can mean is you can still sniff that clear text SIO. You can put that onto a Magic MyFair Classic card, because those can have SIOs on them as well. And it's not really a good Magic Desfire, but it doesn't bind to the card technology, just the card serial number. So if you can change the serial number on a different technology, that's something that would be great if it fixed. It'd also be great if, when using OSDP, it could actually signal the technology type back to the controller. That's probably a bigger change. But also disable technologies you're not using as well. Like, even if you're using iClass, like unless you're thinking of moving to MyFair Classic, but why would you? Disable MyFair Classic too, right? Like, you can't disable Signo, but that's where you should be anyway. So it's fine, leave Signo on, but disable everything else. There might be downgrade attacks that, you can't defeat the whole system, but you can do bad things. The other bit is stop using standard keys. Now, this wouldn't fix you from this, right? Because if you've got an elite keyed iClass SE card, if the keys aren't being checked, doesn't matter if the keys are standard, elite, custom, it's bypassed. But it's still an issue, right? Like, if I can go to eBay and for $10 buy a reader and rip the SAM out of it, or just buy a SAM on a PCB and start doing dirty things to it, SAMs are really great at securing things, but the HID ecosystem is complex. So it only takes one vulnerability to get keys, and then if everyone's got the same keys, I've broken everyone. Whereas if you've got your own custom keys, step one, I need to get a SAM that's yours, not just any HID SAM. I need to go to your facility, rip a reader off the wall, and now I've got one chance at getting this right. Whereas if I can buy like a bunch of used Revy readers for $10 pop off eBay, if I brick a SAM while mucking with it, like, that's okay, it was $10. I don't have to go to your facility, because if I nick a reader once, I'm probably not getting away with that twice. And, you know, you'll notice, right? You'll notice that a reader's just gone. You want to be using your own keys, not the same. And there's other problems too. So CEOS or HID DESFi EV3 with elite keys are probably fine. I've been in this game long enough to know that nothing's certain. But CEOS cards are cheap now. Back in the day, they were like $15 a pop. That's expensive. These days, I believe they're cheaper than PicoPass when you buy them through official channels. And I believe HID's doing that not because they cost less to them, but because they realize that so many people just pick the cheapest option. And it makes HID look bad. When I've seen news articles of new installs in the last few years, you know, rolling out HID readers and then finding out that they're using legacy standard keyed credentials on a brand new install with Signo readers, it's like, what? But I'm sure it was the cheapest option at the time. So I think HID have done the right thing by changing their pricing model to make CEOS cards the cheapest option, because people will buy the cheapest, and that needs to be the secure option. And if people are buying the cheapest and that's not secure, it makes everyone have a bad time, including HID, because it hits their rat. Like, you've seen the IPVM articles. Yeah. And use elite keys, not just for your cards, but also for the SIOs. That might be hard to check as a customer, especially on a secure card technology where you can't just sniff it. But defense in depth, right? You want to be using your own keys to read the card. You want to be using your own keys to encrypt the data on the card. Yeah. Or, you know, other vendors, but they got problems too. And a lot of these principles apply across the whole ecosystem. There's HID are not the only ones to use standard keys. I believe getting elite keys from HID now is free. I know other companies do things of like, the standard key's free, but if you want a custom key, that's extra. That's shit. Standard, like, per customer keys should be the standard. But I understand why. It's convenient. It's easy, right? But we're on security. So some shout-outs. I want to acknowledge all the prior RFID research, especially that of Milosch and Flavio with their iClass work. It's amazing. If you do nothing else, like, just Google those two names or go to like the Proxmark 3 documents folder. It's like an old web server that shows your file listing, and it's got an archive of all these papers. There is some really great shit in there. Good bedtime reading if you can't get to sleep too. It's sometimes a bit math heavy. Also want to thank Jonathan Westhouse, who made the original Proxmark 3, and the Iceman, who took over maintaining the firmware for many, many, many years now. A lot of this, like, while implementing emulators, it was a beautiful tool, because a reader's going to either work or not, and you don't know why it didn't work. Proxmark, you can look at this, you can sniff it, you can increase timeouts on the Proxmark so that your code doesn't have to run fast enough. You can make sure that your code works, even if it's not fast enough, to at least go right. It's definitely just a timing issue, not something else. Best tool for RFID research. Also want to give a shout out to the entire RFID hacking community. You're all great. But some special mention to Nick Draffen, TCPRST, who's doing the RFID CTF stuff, and he had an awesome talk along with Babak, who's also on my awesome shout-out list just before. If you missed it, check the recording. It was great. I'll give a shout-out to Eric Betsy. He's got the propeller hat. He's also awesome. He wrote the PicoPass code originally for the Flipper Zero that can read cards, and also Cedar, which was a great framework for me to then add emulation support on top of. I mean, I didn't have to do everything from scratch. And also just generally great guy. Pat, ZV8. Sadly, he couldn't be here at DEF CON today, but he is also awesome, and just like being able to bounce ideas off these people. Equip as well, awesome bloke. Killer Geek, he made the NARD add-on that CD uses, so that's the actual physical SAM board that plugs into the Flipper, whereas Eric Betts did the software side. And finally, I want to give a massive shout out to Kate, Mystial Dev. It was also does a lot in the RFID research and was given a shout out in Nick Babak and Aaron's talk. Like sometimes just being able to, if you don't know the term rubber ducking, Google it. It's great. Like there's sometimes where you've got a vulnerability and you don't know who to talk to because you don't want to just drop this. Having someone you can confide those things in and get advice from and help you with contacting vendors and that sort of thing. Massive shout out, all awesome people. And the final thank you is to HID because I think they've changed over the last few years, especially with how receptive they are to security researchers. I think they're starting to do the right thing with improving their product. I didn't get a single legal threat. I'm very pleased with that. And yeah, I think they are improving for the better, but it is a long, hard road, especially when you've got legacy technical debt. But they're trying, and that's all you can ask for, really, as long as it's in the right direction. And there's definitely some companies that haven't started going in that right direction yet. So definitely huge props to HID. And if you do find something in HID, definitely it's worth approaching them. They're not going to lawyer up and try and silence you. Yeah. Any questions? I don't know how much time I've got left. I think negative, maybe. But if you do have any, I'll be on the table over there. You can hit me up afterwards. Yeah.